Going over the study that I looked at, it was about the characteristics of victims of sexual abuse by gender and race in community corrections population. Um, just meaning that out of the people that were going to correctional facilities, they had certain characteristics that made them more predisposed to have experiencing or having experienced sexual abuse. And this was categorized by gender and race, and um, it was also to see how gender and race can play a role among victims of sexual abuse, and also what conditions make them more, I guess, in a way, predisposed to experiencing sexual abuse. Um, I found a connection to, or I guess, an underlying connection to Cade's article. There was a pretty clear association between drug use and sexual abuse. Typically, if you were sexually abused, you were more likely to abuse substances, whether it be opiates, cocaine, marijuana, or alcohol. Something that I found was something that I thought was pretty surprising was the drug choice differed by test group, and that was pretty surprising. Okay. So data was collected over a 5-year period from correctional facilities in the southeast of the U.S. Measurements for this study were race and gender primarily, and there was a total of almost 20,000 participants. Um, of this number, only 6.7% reported sexual abuse. Keep in mind that this is only the number reported. There could be very well be unreported cases, and this could this will be mentioned later on. So. Of these reported cases, almost half of them were white women, a quarter of them were African American women, 16% were white men, and about 8% were African American men. So you can see that there's a quite a big difference between men and women in cases of sexual abuse. Any non-white or African American individuals were excluded from the study. I guess that's just what the researchers wanted to do, keep it simple. Um, Data collection was performed in an interview fashion, so they were asked a series of questions, and the researchers reported on social, psychological, and medical conditions, as well as socio-demographic conditions, which include age, education, health insurance, employment, and living situation. And then there were statistical tests ran to determine association of these conditions to sexual abuse and race and gender. Um, the results were pretty showed a very similar pattern among all four race gender groups, um, with not much deviating from the regular pattern except for a few cases. Something that was very common among all groups is that in those that experienced sexual abuse, attempted suicide and suicide ideation, or the thoughts, suicidal thoughts, was higher. Um, Also, having lower education levels typically made you more susceptible to having sexual abuse, or those who had experienced sexual abuse typically had lower education levels. This wasn't the case for African American who who African American men who hadn't experienced sexual abuse typically had a lower education level. This is something that I found very, uh, I guess, perplexing because I couldn't think of my own reasoning why this would be the case. But later on, more on that later. Um, and then there's a variety of other, um, I guess, characteristics that were associated with sexual abuse. Um, there were some differences by race, however, that deviated from the pattern. White men were more likely to have an opiate dependency. Men and women of African American descent were also more likely to be older when entering uh, community correctional facilities than their non-abused counterpart. And African American men were typically better educated than their non-abused counterparts. Overall, victims of sexual abuse were more dysfunctional than non-abused individuals. Um, these are some statistics. that are shown, um, the number of cases for each, I guess, category, and then whether or not they were abused or not, as well as um, some of the characteristics. There's more, but I couldn't fit it all. Moving on, the previous graph showed only the first two tests, or like the conclusion of the first two tests, which were chi-squared and ANOVA tests. Um, in this case, they also ran a logistic regression, which disproved some of the associations that had been made in the previous two tests. This was because of it discounted overlapping variants. So characteristics that I guess overlapped were no longer were exempt, and so some of the associations that we saw previously were no longer significant in terms of statistics. But some things that did stay the same were the suicide attempts and slash ideation was consistent over all groups. This can be seen very clearly over here. The asterisks show that it has a lower p-value, um, and the lower the p-value means the more statistically significant it is in this case. Um, as, you, as you can see, the three asterisks means it was a 0.001, so a 0.1% chance that it was just random. Um, and this throughout all groups is very significant. There's a couple other spots where you can see significance. For example, education in white women, but it's not visible in other groups. It also is seen in African American men who had higher education than their non-abused counterparts. Um, Health insurance was I guess, characteristic seen in only whites. Um, those who had lack of health insurance were more likely to be abused. Um, I'm not entirely sure why this is the case, and they didn't really mention it in the paper. It's also another thing that I guess was interesting. Um, Along with that, there was a variety of other associations that could be made. For example, if one had been medicated for mental issues, um, it was typically an association with being sexually abused, except for African American men. Trading sex for drugs was seen with all sexually abused groups except white men. And then violent offenses and cannabis dependencies were seen with specifically white women. I thought this was quite interesting since typically we see, or as a society, there is a disposition to see black men as more violent or more likely to commit violent crimes. But in this case, if one was sexually abused, it was most likely to be a white woman to commit a violent offense than black men or white men for that matter. Um, Cocaine dependence was seen in sexually abused African American women. And then I don't know why this is the case, but the the drug of choice was different. For example, white men were more likely to abuse opiates, African American women cocaine, and white women cannabis. Again, I don't know. Maybe it's just because of the availability of these drugs, or some other reason that that I do not know. Um, but this was something that I found very interesting as well. Some findings and conclusions. The four main points that can be drawn from the study is that women are more likely to be sexually abused, as you can see by the starting statistic, how 50% were white women and 25% were African American women. They make up a very large portion of the statistic, while men as a whole only make up about 25% of the statistic. Um, Sexual abuse is associated with an increased risk of attempting suicide. That one was very apparent through the logistic regression test. um, not only in attempting suicide but also suicide ideation. Sexual abuse is also associated with substance use disorders, so just misusing cannabis, alcohol, opiates, cocaine, um, all these drugs and misuse are more prevalent having been sexually abused. Victims of sexual abuse tend to have more mental health problems and be more involved in the mental health care system. Um, I don't know if this ends up being a good thing. Well, I guess a bad thing that they have more mental health problems, but a good thing that they are more involved in the mental health care system. Because while there is more prevalence to being uh, mentally ill, the fact that they're within the healthcare system means that they should be getting the help that they need. But I guess that could be a whole nother discussion. In connection to Cade's article, there wasn't too much to connect except for the drug dependency issue from sexually abused victims. Um, Victims of abuse were more likely to have a dependency of some kind and therefore need a drug treatment program. My study did not include Latinos like Cade's did, but it was also, I guess, more straightforward about these two specific groups, whites and blacks. Some limitations of the study was that it was retrospective and self-reported data, so individuals could have lied or not reported incidents due to a variety of reasons, many of them being like social stigma and others. The term race also can be interpreted in different ways, and this can cause a gray area depending on one's point of view. Um, I know that I believe the census considers Latinos white, right? Unless otherwise like stated. So I don't believe this study included Latinos under the white category, but I know that some, I guess, organizations and people do. So that could be another, I guess, issue. And then the timeline of individuals could be skewed. An example of this could be did the substance abuse begin before or after sexual abuse? So basically, just meaning did one lead to the other, or was it vice versa? Um, it's just a little thought. One thing that I really do want to know was about how African American males have a higher education than their non-abused counterparts, right? And if you have any thoughts or ideas on as to why, please let me know, because I actually am very curious about this. And I racked my brain for some time, and I couldn't think of anything that made sense, um, at least within my logic. So, thank you very much for listening.